Hello and welcome to Tigers by the Fire, a podcast out of Holy Cross High School discussing World War II stories. Today we're going to be looking at Swedish neutrality in World War II. This is a topic that can be somewhat controversial due to how Sweden operated during the war. And I'm going to introduce my two co-hosts. I have Mr. DiMaggio and Mr. Davis.
Hello.
How's it going?
I think DiMaggio is going to lead us off.
So basically, I was looking on some social media website and I saw someone that was from Sweden, and they seemed very mad about what their country did in World War II. So I was wondering, because I was in this class, I was like, what did Sweden do that this person was so mad that? And I eventually found a bunch of information, so I decided to make this podcast on it with Bryce here. So I want to start off by saying that before the war, really, Sweden was very impacted by the Great Depression of the 1930s, and their economy was so bad at one point that they were indebted to multiple nations because they needed to outsource a lot of their production. And a lot of this came from the fact that really a lot of the European nations and nations along those lines were impacted from America and their eventual downturn in the 30s. And they eventually even had to abandon the gold standard, as many nations did at that time, to basically make their currency less valuable so they could have more of it and have their nation and their economy more stable. So this led to more agricultural society, more material society, in which they had to outsource trading. And this was different from a lot of nations at that time, especially in Scandinavia, who were trying to get a lot of what they did in terms of economy inside of their nation, while Sweden, and they're very popular at the time, Social Democratic Party, were trying to outsource basically and trade and build relations with much more powerful countries. If you want to add anything, Bryce?
Well, yeah, no. Sweden was heavily reliant on German coal for energy, and Germany also relied on Swedish ore. This is why, how should I say, the relationship between Sweden and Germany was never bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, they have a kind of an interconnected trade relationship, and obviously in the Baltic, if you're Sweden, your options of major countries to trade with are pretty limited. You could go to the USSR, who they didn't completely agree with on a lot of things, or you go to the up and coming kind of Germany. And so, yeah, it was a mutually traded stuff, coal and iron ore. They both needed each of them.
Yeah, and also Sweden wasn't exactly on the best terms with USSR, considering that Finland was about to get invaded by the USSR shortly after. And Sweden was basically their iron ore trade. I feel like this isn't talked about enough, and it was talked about later in the war, and especially now. It kind of had a rise in the late 1900s from people in Sweden discussing what exactly their role was in World War II and if they did as much as some people think they did. So a lot of what their issue was their iron ore was so important to Germany. It was about 10 million tons a year at a point in the war, until eventually the Allies basically started having issues with this because they noticed that how important Swedish ore was, iron ore, to making German weapons. So they eventually tried to downturn it. Eventually it was down to 7.5 million, but we'll get to that later. But really it's important to just note that Sweden at this point, they were kind of struggling. This is important for the moral argument. They were struggling at this point. They knew a war with Germany would not be the best. And, I mean, they did the best they could, but there is some issues with some of the stuff they did that they definitely could have avoided. So,
yeah, I think, too, when you look at their geographic location, you have Norway, which obviously, as you said, gets invaded. And then you also have Finland on the other side also getting invaded. So they're kind of sandwiched in that Scandinavian pocket. And the question kind of becomes, if you don't side or have trade agreements with somebody, what's going to happen to you in all likelihood?
I believe Sweden, they recognized that they could not take a head-on front fight with Germany, and they recognized themselves as being inferior or weaker to them. So they basically just sold them iron, and they allowed German troops to pass their territory. They allowed them to ship weapons through territory.
So basically, Sweden at this time was trying to cement themselves as what they would consider a pacifist nation, as they had been for about 600 years prior to that. Sweden, ever since the real last war was the Swedish-Norwegian War in 1814, in which they lost about a third of their land, so they didn't want anything like that to happen again. They retained essentially a very pacifist stance all the way up until World War II, which they tried to do even then. But even at the beginning of World War II, when Finland was getting invaded and Norway was already taken by Germany, there was many Swedish soldiers and Swedish civilians who wanted to volunteer. They wanted to basically, a lot of them, about 150 of them or so, volunteered to go to the SS actually. And while Sweden didn't necessarily support this, they also didn't deny them because they, of course, were trying to stay neutral. But it's also true a lot of times when a nation's government kind of stays silent or whatever, the nation's people are usually what signify the nation's beliefs. So this is kind of where the argument that Sweden was purely neutral in this war kind of falls off.
Yeah, I think too from Nazi ideological perspectives too, they looked at the Nordic peoples as being in that higher grouping, and so the Swedes would fall into that. And historically, the Swedes did have a very strong military tradition. But you're right, over time, by the late 1800s into the 20th century, they're really kind of a non-military factor, and they just try and kind of make sure their place in the world is secure through trade and through these relationships with Germany. But there's definitely, I think, a close-knit bond that takes place as well.
So now, before we get to this argument of exactly what happened during the war in terms of military, I'm gonna have Bryce here read off some of the Hague Convention's terms, which is what they were running on at the time in terms of what a neutral power would be and what is expected out of them. So we have some here that I feel are important to some of the stuff we're about to go over in a second here.
All right, so it goes. Chapter 1, Article 2. Belligerents are forbidden to move troops and convoys or either munitions or war supplies across the territory of neutral power. Chapter 1, Article 5 states that the neutral power must not allow any of the acts referred to in Articles 2 or 4 to occur on its own territory. It is not called upon for a neutral power to punish acts committed in other countries. And in Article 7, it states that the neutral power is not called upon to prevent the transport of anything useful to the war effort. And finally, in Article 10, it states that the neutral power resisting, even though force, is not a hostile action.
So what's important about this isn't one of those war criminal discussions where a lot of them were made after the war. This was in 1907 that these were established. So they were clearly known and recognized heavily by the Swedish government. So, of course, in November 30th, 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland, and this was, of course, a major threat to Sweden, who had absolutely no chance of stopping the huge army that the USSR had at the time. And they had the neutral policy, but many of them joined Finland in support against USSR.
Yeah, and they had a lot of anti-Soviet sentiment in their country already, so I think that was a pretty easy fight to do. Plus, it was the invasion of another Nordic nation, which I think was important.
Yeah, so there's always a lot of brotherhood associated with Scandinavian countries, as in they think, when I think of Scandinavia, I usually think of them all three together: Finland, Norway, and Sweden. And this was not always the case in these times, as Finland was usually more of a almost nationalistic nation at this time, while Norway was kind of moving in the same direction, but this was in terms of more economy. They did a lot of, as I said earlier, they want to keep the economy more with them. And Sweden kind of went the complete opposite route, where around 55 or 52% of their nation voted Social Democrat in one of their elections around that period. So all three of them, while they still had a very close bond in terms of nationality, in terms of race, in terms of ethnicity and culture, they were still very different in terms of how their societies operated at this time, especially in such a contentious period.
So in getting to, I guess, the actual German aspect of this and into more of the war part, where do they find themselves in terms of relationships with Germany as their war picks up, the German war specifically, in 1939 and then into 1940?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, when Operation Barbarossa was getting underway, when the Germans were launching this massive plan to invade the lines of Russia, Sweden was a major factor in this because not only did Germans know they could trust Sweden, because earlier in the war in 1940 they moved many troops through the lines of Sweden, through the railroads, all the way through to Norway, which was not a huge factor in taking Norway because it didn't really put up that much resistance to the German army. It still built up trust that they could use in the future, which they did, and they used it against the Soviet Union. Many things happened in that, and really just the relationship they built, they were mostly iron ore, was very impactful for the future of the war for Germany. And specifically, I wanted to talk about what they did in the big year for all of this was 1940, really. In July of 1940, Germany was allowed to transport troops to Norway on Swedish railways, which, again, was not that big of a deal. In the terms of war, it wasn't that big of a deal, but socially and politically, it really was. And they continued in July of 1940 as well. They allowed German transport on their rail line from Storline, which is near the large city of Trondheim in Norway, to Riksgrensen, which is also in Norway. And this made it easier for Germany to ship war materials, but was still, as well, only a minor difference over what they would have done if they just would have went around Sweden. So a lot of the argument for why Sweden remained neutral is they would have gotten destroyed by Germany. But they did a few times deny Germany from doing things like in 1941, Germany moved an entire division, this is the biggest real, outside of iron ore, this is the biggest transport they ever did through Sweden. An entire division moved through Sweden, and Sweden argued that this was not going against the Hague Convention. As we read earlier, it is going against the Hague Convention according to what the word said, but they argued that it did not go against it because Finland was not a hostile country, that all hostilities had already been ceased in Finland because Finland was already they were already Germany, a part of Germany at this point, and not a hostile nation that was at war. So they argued that they were not a co-belligerent in the war, and they cannot be considered a power that could be threatened. So that's basically how they try to get around that, which has a few flaws in it, considering that it wasn't really Germany. It was still a separate country that was already conquered. So that's where I have an issue with that.
Yeah, it seems like the government, a lot of just arguments to try and justify what they do throughout the 1940s. Really until the war ends, they're trying to justify each thing. And they have a couple little things like you guys put in there that they try and reduce certain travel or the banking system and stuff like that. But it looks on the surface like more of a just justifications for helping out the Germans.
Yeah. So basically, they did deny, however, when the Germans left for Operation Barbarossa across Sweden and went into Russia, they tried to come back the same way, and Sweden said no this time around. So, and they weren't punished heavily or anything. So it's not like if they denied Germany's every little request, they would be eviscerated. They were still alive. They still survived that. Maybe they thought this was their one-off opportunity, that they didn't want to do this anymore, but they remained relatively stable despite denying Germany a few times. And also, this isn't the only thing. The weirdest thing I found about this was that there was a few times where, at the beginning of the war, Germany flew planes over Sweden, and Sweden, not really liking this very much, tried to shoot down one of their planes with a panzer train, which is essentially an armored train capable of firing weapons of all types. And all in all, about 20 or a little over 20 people, Swedish soldiers, died throughout the war due to different scenarios where they were shot down.
Different engagements. Even in 1943, the Swedish government turned down a request by the Bank of Sweden itself. So the Swedish government stopped the Swedish banks from asking Germany to insure them about incoming gold deposits that were not looted. This goes back to them dropping the gold standard. They were rejected out of fear of annoying the Germans. And
obviously the bank, not wanting looted gold. It's important, too, to understand what's going on in Germany in 1943 with bombing campaigns. And I'm sure if you're Sweden, there's probably a fear that that could be turned on you if you appear to be outwardly accepting looted gold and helping the German war effort.
Yeah. And that's the same thing where places like Portugal did as well, which were mostly neutral. Like Portugal, even though they had what was essentially a fascist dictator, they remained neutral and got gold from Germany. And the thing that's important about the Sweden denying the bank's assurance about if the gold was looted or not is that Sweden, here's a good quote that can explain that. Stuart Eisenstadt, former American ambassador to the European Union, stated that Sweden felt fear of a Nazi invasion until Germany's loss at Stalingrad. After this, the Swedes cooperated with Germany for economic benefit and continued to profit from their trading links with Germany, and thus contributed to prolonging one of the bloodiest conflicts in history. So, at this point, it wasn't really as much of a we're scared we're going to get invaded because, to be honest with you, Germany didn't really have the time or they didn't want to put in the effort to invade Sweden. That really was already giving them enough as it was. So at this point, it was really just beneficial for Sweden to keep the allegiance.
Yeah, so what factor do you think really, I guess, caused them to keep that allegiance with Germany? If it's not fear, then what are they really after in that then?
I think there was a certain aspect of fear, maybe not completely fear, but I think a lot of it was definitely economics, to where while Germany could have still taken over Sweden, and they were still getting a lot of iron ore from Sweden, which the Allies were taking huge problems with. The main issue is I saw a couple explanations for why Sweden could have been doing this. One I found very interesting was if Sweden let Germany come in and invade, basically control Sweden, how much more than 10 million tons of iron ore would they have gotten? They would have had full control over the entire peninsula of Scandinavia. And what really could they have done at that point what could Sweden's government have done to limit the supply of iron ore being given to Germany? And is that even a possible explanation for why they were neutral? I just think that's definitely possible. That's what they were thinking at the time, and definitely what was best for their country. Since they were still, as I mentioned earlier, they were still not the best. They were still indebted to a bunch of nations, so they wanted what was the best for their people at the time. They didn't really care too much about what was going on in other nations, and not that they really even had the capacity to care, because they really wouldn't be able to do anything against a much, much stronger German force.
So I think that brings up the question, as you've kind of alluded to, morality of this. Where do you guys, I guess, look, or how do you guys feel about them in terms of the moral dilemma of supporting Nazis?
I believe that in the beginning of the war, less powerful Sweden was intimidated by, this world power, Germany. But as time went on and Germany fought a two-sided war, they recognized that they couldn't just go in and take Sweden. Sweden knew that Germany had other things to do, and that's why in 1944, Sweden's government took action and essentially ended all trade with Germany. Because they started having more relations with the Allies, they just figured we can kind of back out of this deal with Germany and enter and align ourselves with the people who are going to win. Because they can see the downfall.
Yeah, it's funny because in 1944, as you just said, the war was turning, and just so happened Sweden was also beginning to turn as they started limiting ball bearing production in April 1944 to Germany. And in August and September of 1944, they essentially cut off all trading with Germany at this point. They basically just were, because what's important to understand is that the Allies had already suspected multiple times and already tried multiple times to convince Sweden to let them basically occupy their northern cities to cut off production of iron ore, which was, again, very important and not something a lot of people focus on, as they focus more on the actions of letting troops go through. And that is actually a very, very small detail in terms of the complete iron ore production that was given to Germany.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the troops might be less significant than the actual trade, because Germany obviously was resource dependent and didn't have all these resources. And when you're making a modern steel-based army, you need all that stuff.
So when we're getting into the moral argument, I think it's important to see where they started off at, because once they kind of started on getting down this path of trade, it's kind of hard for them to stop at that point, especially against Germany, who knows what would have happened if they would have cut them off like before 1944. So in the beginning, after the Battle of Atlantic, when basically the Atlantic Sea route and trade routes were being demolished, especially Swedish ships, Sweden decreased trade with Britain by 70%. And to make up for this, instead of their economy crashing as it was already struggling from the Great Depression, they had 37% of their entire economy was based off of Germany, exporting products to Germany. And what would have happened if they would have cut this off? So at this point, it's more of a international versus our country defense. And if you're a politician, usually you support your country because you don't really have the room at this point to go against what your people elected you for. So I think that while I don't think they were neutral at all, because of course, especially considering what they actually were judging it on, they violated multiple aspects of the Hague Convention, and they really they try to retain neutral, but they just didn't do that. And it was kind of impossible to. You can't really expect them to retain neutrality, especially when everything around them is getting invaded, and they don't really have any room to retain neutrality, or they might crash. And this is what I find more important, the moral argument. In terms of morality, I feel like Sweden definitely made a few errors, especially after 1944, when they personally thought that there was really no threat of being invaded. And I feel like they didn't try enough to try to cut it off, especially when they knew what was happening with Germany and the amount of places they were invading, especially their neighbors. If I was Norway, I would personally feel betrayed by Sweden, being so close and being so interconnected throughout history. And I understand at the same time that there was really nothing Sweden could have done against Germany, so it's better that they survive and not be invaded, because we don't know what could have happened if they were invaded. We don't want all those people to be ousted. And another point of this argument is another wrong Sweden did is that they could have easily accepted way more Jewish people out of Europe in the beginning of the war. They could have accepted migrants, as many nations did, and to keep more of a, of course, that Scandinavian pride that we were talking about, especially earlier in history, they denied many of them, which could have saved many lives. So that's another knock on their moral standards.
I believe that Sweden chose themselves over the other countries, the Allies, because, they wanted to keep themselves afloat. That's natural. Any country, any politician, leader, dictator, whoever it may be, they would want to prioritize their people, their country, themselves over other countries, other people, other dictators. And I think that's natural. And you're right when saying the moral dilemma. It is a moral dilemma, but I don't think it was a question for the Swedish.
Yeah.
I believe that the neutrality, not entirely is a front, but you could say they're just saying that to get by, in a sense. They just want to stay afloat. They don't want to pick a side. They want to hover. They go a little here, they dabble a little here, they do a little that, and they just kind of float.
Yeah. That's really the only thing they could have done at that point. And while it may sound very bad for Sweden at this point, because we mentioned a lot of bad things they did, and a lot of complacency they had in trying to stop a lot of what happened, it's also interesting to point out that they did help the Allies after Stalingrad. And even on June 13th, 1944, a V-2 rocket, which was, of course, something that was very threatening for the Allies that the Germans were developing, which pretty much allowed pinpoint bombing of places that was never seen before. One of them crashed in Sweden, and the Swedes gave the parts to Britain in exchange for some Spitfires. Mm-hmm. I just want to say that I find it interesting that, and actually I find it that it's a good thing that this recently became an issue, and that recently Swedish people, because I don't know where this came from all of a sudden, I just saw someone who was very mad about what their country did, and I'm actually glad that people are looking into their country's history and looking into what they did was moral and trying to fix from that, because I found what I found in my research was personally very interesting. I didn't know, because the whole time I was reading through this, I was thinking, what would I have done if I was in charge of Sweden? Because there's really no right decision because you don't know what's going to happen. I feel like many of the things they did, they handled correctly for their own nation. They may have, of course, helped prolong the war for Germany, and they may have done wrong in many aspects, like not allowing Jewish people in or giving their people the opportunity to go into Sweden and join the or go into Finland and join the SS, to many atrocities they probably committed during their reign across Russia. But it's also important to understand that every time they were really given an opportunity to step back, they looked like they did. Now, if this was out of them feeling bad for the things they did and stepping back and limiting trade, limiting the different things they were doing for Germany, I don't know. It could have also been they were just scared of allies, so they were like, oh, yeah, we'll do whatever you say. Well, if Germany comes back, we'll do whatever they say. But sometimes maybe you could just give Sweden the benefit of the doubt, and maybe they did do it out of a moral standpoint.
I'd say that it all is based on perspective. What's right and wrong comes from your perspective.
Yeah, and they're not the only country who made those types of decisions. And at the end of the day, they're trying to save the lives of their people, because the fear is if you outwardly support Germany all full tilt, Russians might come in, American, British might bomb you. Support the other side, the Germans might do the same thing. They could easily terror bomb, turn those V2 rockets at them. So they're making, as you guys said, kind of the decision based on their population. But the best part about this is it shows you, too, that every country kind of has these types of issues that you can look at later on and kind of debate whether or not they should have done what they did.
One more thing.
Yeah,
more thing. So I just want to say that this is an aspect of basically why they came upon this deal with Germany and this deal with how they were going to handle the war, because this is, of course, Sweden was a democracy and they were trying to exist in a landscape where everything around them was basically falling apart. And on the subject, George Leverrier Jones, member of History's Now magazine, wrote, "The four-party coalition that ruled Sweden was in disagreement, with the conservative and agrarian parties, the Swedish Foreign Office, and Gustav V all wanting to grant Germany permission. In opposition, the Social Democratic Party and the Liberal Party wanted to adhere to their foreign policy, which was, of course, neutrality." And it's important that if you read that again, the people that wanted to stay neutral were two parties out of the rest of the people in Gustav V. So it's sometimes important to understand that just because you might be the lesser number, that if you can relate to people's morals, and neutrality, of course, was most likely the moral decision here, definitely not allying with Germany at this point, that you can come to a better conclusion. So I think Sweden did the best they could in this, and they definitely, operating in a democratic society, made the best decision for themselves and probably a few other people as well.
Well, thank you guys. Very good discussion. And this is Tigers by the Fire, episode 6. Thank you.